Again, thank you guys for joining today. So as Tracy mentioned, I'm Allison Clemens. I'm also a co-director here at NJJN. And for folks who are new to this work, in 2015, NJJN's membership community put out a policy platform that called for the end to housing use in for-profit facilities, really citing the harmful conditions and human rights violations, as well as really this fundamental concern that shareholder profits were placed above the safety of kids. And unfortunately, the concerns were tragically affirmed when Cornelius Fredericks died at Lakeside Academy, which was run by Equal Youth and Family Services in 2020. So in the wake of his death, NJJN really partnered with the National Disability Rights Network and launched the Stop Sequel campaign, which was focused on closing these harmful sequel facilities that so many young people were placed at across the country. And still, we know that sequel is just the tip of the iceberg, right? That in order to protect kids, we have to have systemic reforms. And so we're really thrilled that Eileen O'Grady and Corey Bernstein are here with us today to give us an overview of the web of private equity in the youth serving system and potential advocacy avenues that we can move forward as a field to keep kids safe and hold companies accountable. So just brief biographies for Eileen and Corey. Eileen is the research and campaign manager for the Private Equity Stakeholder Project, which released The Kids Are Not All Right, detailing the role of private equity in youth serving systems. And Corey Bernstein is a staff attorney and all-around private equity extraordinaire by everyone's description with the Disability Rights New Jersey. And he was instrumental in informing some of their recommendations on private equity in their report, Desperation Without Dignity. So without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'll turn it over to you, Corey and Eileen.
Just going to share my screen here. Beginning. Is it showing?
Yep, we can see
okay,
it.
Great.
It's in presenter mode though, so we can see the notes.
That's unfortunate.
Or it's not in presenter mode, I mean.
I see. Stop. Sorry about this.
Okay, good.
All right, there you go. Okay, I'll talk to you after. Bye.
Okay, bye.
There you go.
Good. Is the slideshow beginning now? Sorry, this is embarrassing.
Can somebody respond?
Is the slideshow visible to the audience?
It is, Corey. You have
Oh.
Yes, Corey, it is.
Okay, I'm so sorry.
Yeah, we
then.
could see it,
No,
Corey.
no
It'll just have the notes in it, but that's all right.
Oh well. Oh my God. Wait. Now?
perfect.
That's it.
Okay, sorry about
Thank you,
that.
Corey.
I am Corey Bernstein with Disability Rights New Jersey and not the most technologically inclined, and I'm really happy to be here and be working on this with Eileen. If you.
Yeah, I'm Eileen O'Grady from the Private Equity Stakeholder Project. And like Allison mentioned, I have been doing research on the impact of private equity investments in behavioral health more broadly and more recently in youth-specific services.
Great. So just to go over just a roadmap and then some goals for our presentation, we're going to start. Eileen will explain what private equity firms are and their general practices. And then we'll apply this information to the behavioral health sector and explain how these practices affect youth and the behavioral healthcare industry at large. Then I'll detail the inadequate regulatory system that allows these firms to operate and continue their harmful practices. And finally, we'll offer some policy recommendations and introduce a framework for advocacy within a larger collective at the end. And these are just some goals that we have and we hope that you're able to get from this presentation. And first is to demystify the financial operations at private equity owned facilities and connect the business model that they use to inadequate service quality and absence of meaningful oversight, and reframe this conversation on our terms as a youth justice and disability justice issue. So throughout the presentation, we're going to focus on a few providers, particularly CEQA Youth and Family Services. One of the challenges of dealing with private equity is how little information is out there about their operations. So for CEQA and a few other providers and in locations that have had this national scrutiny, there's just more out there that we can talk about. And we also know that there's many different types of youth inpatient settings or youth providers, things like PRTFs and QRTPs and a lot of other acronyms. And so except where we describe otherwise, when we say facility, we mean it in the broadest sense of the word as non-emergency out-of-home care, because what we're talking about is their business model, and it's really applicable for all inpatient settings, including group homes and nursing facilities.
I also wanted to flag that occasionally we'll be using the term behavioral health instead of more specific terms like youth services or systems. And that's partially because that's exactly how the investment firms and industry analysts view the industry in these really broad terms. It's also because, kind of like Corey mentioned, these companies operating in this space cast a really wide net of what they do. So for example, the biggest private equity owned foster care companies do youth residential services, but they also do things like family placements, group homes for people with disabilities, juvenile detention centers, what have you. So behavioral health is a useful umbrella term, if not entirely accurate. And I think we can move on. So why are we focused on private equity? Besides the impacts on care that we'll talk about later, and that I think everyone here is relatively familiar with, it's because the private equity investment in behavioral health has exploded over the last decade, and particularly in the last couple of years. It's become one of the most popular sectors of healthcare for private equity firms to invest in. And just kind of summarizing the numbers here, private equity buyouts made up over half of all of the acquisition activity in behavioral health in 2020. So basically now, more than ever before, investors are gobbling up providers at an accelerating rate. Can move on. Yeah, so as behavioral health, as private equity firms have been investing in behavioral health, they've also been buying up services specifically for youth. So that includes group homes, foster care companies, psychiatric facilities, wilderness camps, detention centers, addiction treatment programs, you name it. So on this slide, I wanted to show a selection of the companies that are currently owned by private equity firms. And I know some of you may recognize some of these, like obviously SQL. Others might be operating more under the radar, using different names and branding for different facilities. But all of these companies own multiple facilities in multiple states. I think some of the bigger ones you might recognize are Savita, which is just the rebrand name for Mentor Network, which is the biggest for-profit foster care company in the country. It also runs group homes. There's Perimeter Healthcare, which runs psychiatric hospitals all over the South. Family Help and Wellness is just in some ways a reincarnation of Aspen Education, which was the infamous troubled teen company from the early aughts. And we can move on. So yeah, why behavioral health? I think one of the biggest reasons private equity firms like behavioral health is because it's an incredibly fragmented industry. There are about 19,000 individual companies operating in this space, and not a single company owns more than a 5% market share, which is pretty fragmented. So that means that private equity firms have plenty of opportunities to buy up lots of small companies and to combine them and then sell the company at a profit. So there's also a lot more payers for behavioral health these days, partially due to expanded coverage stemming from these recent policy changes at the federal level through like the Mental Health Parity Act and the ACA, and then through state level coverage expansions. And expanded coverage means more revenue streams. There's also higher utilization of behavioral health services, meaning in most places, the demand for these services outpaces the supply. And crucially, the regulatory scheme for inpatient behavioral health services is highly fragmented and deficient. So this means that facilities can not only get away with putting patients at risk by basically prioritizing profits, but in many cases, the regulatory framework actually actively lets them do it. Next slide. Yeah, so before we get into a deeper discussion of private equity investment in youth services, I think it's first important to understand what private equity is in the first place, since for most people, it's not a term you hear every day. And hopefully in understanding the PE business model, we can better understand what it actually means for the experience of youth at PE-owned facilities. So I want to spend a couple minutes just doing a kind of private equity 101. So in some ways, the simplest way to think about it is to parse the words like I have here. It's private, which means a couple of things. Private means it's not traded on a stock exchange. It also means that it's relatively opaque. Private companies aren't subject to the same kinds of disclosures as public companies, or certainly not nonprofits. It's equity, meaning the firm controls the company, usually with a majority stake. And it also takes on most of the risk, but keeps all of the profit. So one of the key points here is that private equity firms are really, really, really private. And the lax financial disclosure requirements allow owners and what they do to stay secret. So we might know the name of a firm, but nothing else about it, which makes accountability really, really difficult. Next slide. So what private equity firms do can be boiled down to a few basic things that I've tried to communicate in this confusing chart. They invest in companies, usually acquiring a controlling stake in a company. They'll then try to grow the company's cash flow over the next 4 to 7 years. And there's a few ways they do that. They can try to grow the revenue organically, buy up their competitors, and cut expenses. So it's usually some combination of these things. That's how they grow cash flow, so that they can then sell the company at a premium or take it public, and they get to keep all of the resulting profits. And this is the typical life cycle of a private equity investment. And the business model is to do this over and over and over again with a bunch of different companies. Next slide. A key part of this strategy is roll-ups, like I mentioned before. And this is where a private equity firm buys or creates a platform company to then acquire multiple other smaller companies in that market sector. So the strategy is basically buy, combine, and then sell at a profit. So as an example, we can look at Embark Behavioral Health, which was created by a private equity firm called Relay Investments in 2018. And Relay used Embark to acquire and then merge a lot of other independent providers in, I think, 14 states. And they kept the branding for a lot of them. So all of these appear to be different companies, but they're actually now all under a single owner. And this consolidation strategy is pretty much the bread and butter of private equity firms. They can make a lot of money just by combining companies like this without making any real improvements to their operations. Not inherently a bad thing, but creates a lot of transparency issues and difficulty in oversight. So you can continue. One of the other main things to know about the private equity playbook is that it almost always uses debt, and often a lot of debt. Private equity firms buy companies through what's called leveraged buyouts, or LBOs for short. And that just means that the private equity firm uses a lot of debt to acquire companies. So the catch is that the private equity firm doesn't take on the debt itself, the company that they acquire does. So here's an example to illustrate. Let's say a company on the left, before it's acquired by a private equity firm, had $70 million in equity and $30 million in debt. With an LBO, the private equity firm essentially turns the tables so that in buying the company, the private equity firm just uses a tiny bit of its own money and then a lot of debt that it adds to the company's balance sheet, not the private equity firm's. So that means the resulting company, after a private equity firm buys it, now has $80 million in debt that it has to start paying off. And so this is the really important thing to know. In an LBO, the debt is guaranteed by the company, in our case, a youth services provider or behavioral health company, and not the private equity firm, meaning the provider is on the hook if it defaults on that debt, and the provider has to make up all those monthly interest payments. And that means that there's less money to actually spend on operations. But meanwhile, the private equity firm has only put in a tiny amount of its own money. And that means that it has everything to gain and very little to lose, no matter what happens with the company. So next slide. Yeah, Corey, you could take this.
Great. Yeah. So zooming out a little, this is what it might look like for a private equity firm within a larger portfolio. And we can see we have the facility LLC, and then these other things that might not be a facility. It could be a chain restaurant or a retail store, or any number of different companies or businesses. And all of these companies were acquired through leverage buyouts, respectively. And they remain separate legal entities, not only from the private equity firm, but from each other. So if Facility LLC were to go bankrupt or have a civil judgment issued against it, the court can't access the assets or cash flow from D Corp or ALLC or any of their other entities. It's the facility, not the fund or its investments, that bears this risk alone. So this limits losses really to only what was invested into the particular acquisition. But this is also happening separately in each and every single one of their acquisitions and things in their portfolio. So it really limits the risk limits their risk in investing in these companies through leverage buyouts.
Cool. Yeah, and I just have a few more of these technical slides on what private equity is. But seeing how they have this limited liability and accountability, it's not surprising that private equity firms take a very active role in the operations of the companies they buy and steer them toward the goal of immediate profit maximization for their investors. So their number one goal is to double or triple their investment in 4 to 7 years. This is very typical. And that means the company, or again, in our case, the provider often has to reduce overhead costs so it's not swallowed by its newfound debt, and it can generate the returns that the private equity owner expects. They also might have facilities contract with other companies that they own. And that's called related party transactions. We've seen this a lot in private equity owned nursing homes, where they'll contract with, say, a pharmacy services company that they also own, which allows them to overcharge the nursing home for those pharmacy services. And the private equity firm that owns both of them makes money on both sides of the transaction, which is a clear conflict of interest, and it drains money out of the nursing home. They also might engage in financial engineering tactics, like dividend recapitalizations, which I'll actually just explain on the next slide with another confusing chart. So one way private equity firms pull money out of their assets is through dividend recapitalizations, also called debt-funded dividends. And these are transactions where the private equity firm adds debt to their portfolio company's balance sheet in order to then collect a dividend for themselves. And I know that this is often a really confusing concept for people to wrap their heads around. But I think that's partially because it is so unbelievably ridiculous that it's allowed. So as the chart is supposed to illustrate, in a dividend recap, a private equity firm will make the company that it owns take on new debt. And then the company will then use the proceeds of that loan to make a cash payout to the private equity firm. So then the company or the provider is then on the hook to pay back that debt, even though it didn't get to use any of the money that it was loaned. It's basically collateral. So just to ground this in a real world example, the Mentor Network, which I mentioned before, was recently rebranded to Savita, runs group homes and programs for foster youth. It's the biggest for-profit foster care company in the US. And it's owned by two private equity firms called Centerbridge Partners and the Vistria Group. And over the last few years, Centerbridge and Vistria have taken out almost $500 million in debt secured by the Mentor Network and then pocketed that money. And so now Mentor is on the hook for paying back that debt. And this is, I think, particularly significant because over the last 2 decades or more, Mentor Network has been owned by various private equity firms. It's had numerous allegations of abuse and neglect of the people under its care. As recently as 2020, state regulators in Oregon found so many violations at a Mentor group home that they shut it down for good. And yet just a couple months later, the private equity firms that owns it loaded it up with more debt to give themselves a cash payout. So even though the company they own has these like profound quality and compliance issues, they're making money hand over fist and loading the company up to do it with debt to do it. Move on. Yeah, so in terms of value extraction, just to drill this point home, the private equity firm's singular focus when they buy a company is to grow the revenue as much as possible, maybe doubling or tripling it over just a handful of years. And those profit expectations mean that they often have to substantially cut costs while keeping the beds filled. And so what is the biggest cost at PRTFs, for example? It's labor costs. So we see reduced staffing or filling beds without adequate staffing ratios. We see underpaying employees resulting in high turnover and understaffing. We all know there's like an acute staffing shortage and turnover issue with all of these facilities. There's an over-reliance sometimes on unlicensed staff or under-licensed staff to reduce labor costs, failure to provide adequate training, cuts to services and programs like educational programs, and failing to invest in maintaining facilities, which can lead to unsafe or squalid living conditions. To move on. And so there's been some really great research on the impact of private equity ownership of nursing homes. And we don't have the same kind of data now for youth systems or behavioral health, but there's a lot of overlap. So this data on this slide comes from a really fantastic study published in 2021, where the researchers found that after a private equity buyout of a nursing home, short-term mortality of Medicare patients increases by 10%, staffing decreases, patient mobility declines, and pain intensity increases. There's a 50% increase in the probability that patients are taking antipsychotic meds, which has been seen to increase mortality in elderly patients. And we think more patients are taking these meds partially as a result of decreased staffing, as a way to basically more easily manage patients with fewer staff. And then finally, this last bullet basically sums up sort of the financial aspects of the private equity playbook, boils down basically to less money available for patient care, more money flowing to the private equity firm. And
great, thank you so much. It's always helpful when I hear that analysis over again, because I pick up and learn something new. And I think it all begs the question, how do they get away with doing this? And the answer lies in a regulatory scheme that focuses more on service reimbursements rather than treatment quality, and regulates facilities as a financial market rather than on the quality of care, which leaves outmatched states to conduct oversight on their own. And there's 3 key issues that create this dynamic. First, the historical and political factors that led to the federal government's limited relationship with behavioral health services. And then next are the ways that private equity takes advantage of public payor programs and geographic diversity that limits their investment risk and overpowers states. So I want to go first to the federal government's relationship with behavioral health services, and it really stems from its reaction to the deinstitutionalization movement. So just as a brief overview, Deinstitutionalization took off in the 1960s with disability rights advocates really focused on shuttering institutions so that individuals could choose how they structured their lives, encouraging freedom, bodily autonomy, integration, and acceptance into society at large. But deinstitutionalization also had supporters on more conservative ideals, things like reducing state spending on social services and a pick yourselves up by the bootstraps form of self-determination. And for disability rights advocates, this was not a politically convenient alliance. Those actors ignored the next necessary step of deinstitutionalization, creating high quality home and community-based services and an equitable infrastructure for their delivery. These people were in our opposition, but this convoluted rationale shaped and in many ways still shapes federal policy on behavioral health care. It was not always this way. In 1963, President Kennedy signed the Community Mental Health Centers Act, which established outpatient community-based behavioral service centers under a national umbrella. And the results of this were mixed, but by 1977, 1.9 million people received treatment through these centers, children and adults. But in 1981, President Reagan cut funding to the centers, instead providing states with reduced funds through block grants, leaving them to spend money on services independently without federal participation in their delivery and by proxy oversight. There is one place where federal behavioral health spending did increase, though, since the 1980s, and that's on Medicaid and Medicare reimbursements for community-based services. With this shift, federal payments for behavioral health became focused on reimbursements rather than providing the services themselves. And all of this occurred under the backdrop of neoliberalism. And this is a complicated, global, and hotly contested term. Doesn't mean liberal the way that we talk about it in politics, contemporary on the news, but it's really important that we know this to see where things fit in a larger political structure. And for our purposes today, neoliberalism is a legal, political, and economic governance system that favors market imperatives like profits, managerial expertise, and shareholder values over democratic demands for social justice, like a working healthcare system. There's often a real racialized way that neoliberalism manifests. I think a clear example of that would be the Clinton crime bill in the 90s, favoring for-profit prison construction over the democratic demands for social justice of abolition and decarceration. The crucial and often misunderstood part of this neoliberalism and really free market politics is that it doesn't mean a free market where government sits idly by, but an active state that encases these markets in technical regulations so that they're free from public pressure. With this in mind, the current scheme for youth services and behavioral health services and private equity's interest in them take shape. Deinstitutionalization led to facility closures without home and community-based services or an infrastructure for them in place, and a new political order focused on reimbursing services, not providing them, which turned behavioral health care into a complex financial market for outpatient and smaller live-in settings with 16 or less beds that were subsidized by Medicaid and Medicare repayments. With the expanded service coverage for services that Eileen detailed earlier in the last 10 to 15 years, this became a really lucrative industry, and private equity stepped in, profiting through cutting costs that put residents in similarly neglectful conditions to these larger institutions and warehouses of yesteryear. And I think psychiatric residential treatment facilities, or PRTFs, perfectly illustrate this framework of organizing care as a financial market rather than on the services provided. For context, when Medicaid and Medicare were enacted in the 1960s, to promote deinstitutionalization, there's something called the Federal Institutions for Mental Diseases Exclusion, or IMD exclusion. This bars federal spending on psychiatric facility care in settings with 16 or more beds, ostensibly to promote deinstitutionalization. PRTFs are an exception to the IMD exclusion. They can receive federal funding regardless of their bed capacity, but PRTFs can only serve individuals younger than 21 and must purportedly meet highly detailed treatment and reporting requirements, including compulsory reporting of certain incidents to protection and advocacy agencies. So for us at Disability Rights New Jersey, this is a really important provision and way for us to hypothetically gain knowledge of incidents going on. None of these regulations discuss financial engineering or tactics. Nothing what Eileen described earlier. A private equity owned PRTF can legally receive reimbursements from Medicaid, pay shareholders out a dividend, and then make up for it by placing debt on the PRTF through a dividend recapitalization. And I think it's notable that PRTFs don't provide strong outcomes. There was a 2015 federal demonstration where 4,000 children in 9 states received home and community-based services rather than PRTF admission. And this demonstration found that participating children, particularly those with the highest needs and previous interactions with the juvenile justice system, sustained and improved their baseline functioning. And I don't usually like making cost arguments, but it's notable that these services cost only 32% of what comparable PRTF services would have over the demonstration's time period. The federal government spends more money keeping this market afloat than they would by providing services in the community. Compounding this lack of financial practice regulations, there's really no enforcement of the treatment and reporting rules that do exist under federal regulations. CMS has no list or database of PRTFs nationwide. The quality, safety, and enforcement section of the CMS website just redirects you to a section of the same name for nursing facilities. And I checked as of last week and would be surprised if it's been updated since then, but that would be nice. SAMHSA and other agencies publicly confuse PRTFs with state level licensures. And these state licensures might have similar reporting requirements to PRTFs, or maybe even the same, but they're distinct. There are distinct programming from the PRTF. One's federal, the other is with the state. And at Disability Rights New Jersey, we've never received these incident reports, and we're confident we have PRTFs. So we tried for almost a year to obtain a consistent list of PRTFs in our state. We could not. Our Department of Children's and Family provided us a list of 98 PRTFs in the state, but had no knowledge of any incident reporting or how that would work. The Medicaid Quality, Certification, and Oversight database says we have 0 PRTFs. It became clear to us that this dynamic exists in many states between CMS, state agencies, and other outside stakeholders, that this framework just does not work or provide any mechanism for enforcement. And some advocates have responded by taking matters into their own hands. And I just want to highlight this from Disability Rights Arkansas. They created this really phenomenal web database with information on their state's 13 PRTFs and all the challenges that they face obtaining this information. And this work is incredible, but they're really acting as CMS within their state, which is amazing work, but troubling on principle. And so just putting this all together, PRTFs provide inadequate care. They have a ton of rules, but little accountability. It takes advocates a ton of time to parse through how this process and connection should work before realizing that they don't. And all the while, these private equity firms can use their resources to power through the paperwork and ensure they receive their reimbursements from the government. And it becomes clear what PRTFs really are. They're a billing program masquerading as a regulatory scheme. And this facade is important because it lets private equity firms extract government reimbursements as profit without recourse. Through PRTFs and other mechanisms, private equity facilities are almost exclusively funded by public payors. This can be from managed care organizations through Medicaid, Medicare, and many state and municipal programs that are often braided together. So it's hard to tell how much from which source. There are many different payors within states that combine these various pools of money, and this is big business. Facilities can receive up to $800 per day per child in government money. And when I first looked at this, I thought this meant states had the power. Public programs can just stop paying facilities to take kids in. But it's the other way around. Because care is this financial market and there's not these affirmative services in place, these firms to take advantage of very vulnerable kids in poverty or foster care who may have little support systems or resources. And these facilities are the only places that will take them in. So it's easy for them to cut costs and exploit the absence of outside supports once they're there. They can take advantage of billing claim indexes, which are weak. So for example, a private equity owned facility may provide someone care and bill for it that a nurse provided that care, when really it was an unskilled technician, and they're able to profit off the difference between how much they would have received. And describing things this way, it's not speculative. It's what private equity firms openly discuss as what their business model is, as Sequel co-founder Jay Ripley aptly described in a 2015 talk. We focused on public pay because we figured kids are always going to have issues and they're always going to get in trouble. And again, the government has to figure out a way to take care of them. That is saying the quiet part out loud. Continuing on this payer diversity, this is an image from a 2017 presentation by Sequel to investors interested in acquiring it to take it public. So it was publicly filed with the Securities Exchange Commission. The data itself is from 2016, so it's a little outdated, but I still think we could spend hours unpacking everything on here. And I do want to just give everyone a moment to take a look at this. Let your eyes wander if you'd like. I find this slide absolutely fascinating for all the financial information and what it's just taught me a ton about the healthcare system. But the framing is what I'm most interested in as an investment. If we look towards the left side, we can see it lists Sequel's annual revenue towards the bottom, or total revenue in 2016 as more than $200 million, 208,715. I found that just to be a staggering amount, but that's not really what the pitch is. What's in bold and up top isn't the total revenue, but the diversity of payors and locations that it comes from. The bullet points on the top highlight that Sequel has programs in 19 states, and in bold that there's 500 referring agencies, aka payors, throughout the country. The chart and circle graphs towards the middle, showing Sequel's revenue by payor type and geography, also tell this story. So to me, what's really being said by Sequel here to investors is we can withstand the losses of some payors. We can even lose an entire state's payors because we have so many different places that money's coming in. And these losses, these states or different sources pulling funding out are only going to happen when there's mistreatment. So Sequel saying to investors, when you see something like Michigan cutting ties with Sequel altogether after Cornelius Frederick died in restraints at one of our facilities, there's no need to panic. Michigan only provides 6.7% of our annual revenue. This geographic and payor diversity without meaningful federal regulation allows private equity firms, generally operating regionally or nationally, to overwhelm oversight agencies that, as we've seen, are almost exclusively at the state level. These agencies are woefully underfunded. Utah, a state with many youth facilities, their Office of Licensing has 30 employees overseeing 3,000 facilities. That is not a system where meaningful oversight is going to happen. States often have multiple agencies providing oversight, and it's generally the referral agency, which could be things like departments of health, human services, education, developmental disabilities, licensing, etc. But they're all only overseeing a slice of facility operations. None have a full picture of what's going on. The Arkansas database I referenced earlier explains the 5 distinct entities in their state and the local authorities responsible for different parts of PRTF regulation. So this dynamic occurs in all states where information siloed both within and between states. This becomes especially apparent with out-of-state placements when a state sends a child to a facility in another state. The receiving state may not know that that child is in a facility in their state at all. And contrast this with the central management of a facility, generally in a corporate office, where they have a bird's eye view of all their facilities and can coordinate with their private equity firm owners and have access to the fund's millions and billions of dollars in backing. This gives them a major financial and capital advantage. I wanted to show a map of Savita, formerly Mentor Networks, program locations to demonstrate this geographic diversity. But the map, it only shows things by region because there's so many locations. So I just recorded a scroll through the locations listed on their website instead. So we can see there are hundreds here all across the country. And once we get to the bottom, See, there's 5 different service types with dozens of subcategories within those service types. So with all these different locations split by geography and service type and different regulators within the state, private equity owned facilities can keep a low profile, or operators in their jurisdiction, and set up as different corporate entities not liable for each other's debt. It's truly hard to hold a bad actor accountable. And it's unsurprising that it took a multi-year Senate investigation, as Eileen described, to really reveal the depths of Mentor Network's malfeasance. But Senate investigations are not a reliable mechanism for consistent oversight and should be predicated on subsequent legislative efforts. And that's just realistically not a strength of the Senate at this time. The challenge of keeping up with national operations also applies to us as advocates within the Disability Rights Network and the National Juvenile Justice Network as well, because we are not covering all the different things that these providers might be offering. So for example, in early 2018, private equity-backed Strategic Behavioral Health had a youth PRTF in Charlotte, North Carolina, where 10 patients escaped abusive conditions. As this came to light, Strategic was also operating a massive insurance billing scam at an adult facility in Johnstown, Colorado, and was working with the Middletown, Wisconsin City Council to build a new hospital with an estimated $17 million price tag and $1.2 million in public funding. Different names in different states, serving different patient populations. It's just really hard for states and outside advocates to keep up with every private equity-owned multi-state provider. But despite the geographic and payor advantages without federal scrutiny, the last 2 years of advocacy, particularly surrounding SQL, have shown us that advocates can fight back in a way that states cannot, and that's through collective action. When I read Eileen's report that Allison mentioned at the beginning that came out in February, The Kids Are Not All Right, and saw the list of the SQL facility closures since 2020 and the list of states that barred out-of-state placements to SQL, I was inspired and honestly pretty emotional, but also a little dismayed, because I know it took so much work to just take on one provider, but it's still been, it's the most effective route. As the name says, the private equity business model is premised on privacy, keeping transactions and behaviors discreet, obscuring what's really going on. We may not have the united front or resources of a national company, but when we remain engaged with each other, we can break down some of these information silos between advocates that are huge advantages for private equity firms. And we can also link our work with larger movements, as I really think occurred in the advocacy around SQL following Cornelius Frederick's death and private equity's role in it, in connecting to the energy of the moment with the 2020 uprisings and larger movement for Black lives. And I think that the National Disability Rights Network and National Juvenile Justice Network are uniquely set up for us to share these stories and strategies with each other and outside stakeholders, just as we're doing today, having people with the backgrounds of myself and Eileen here discussing this issue. So I really am confident, despite the advantages they have, that this is the most effective way to do things. And the question for me is, how do we not only sustain the efforts that we've done with SQL, but expand upon them? And we're going to discuss some policy now to address that.
Yeah, I'm going to just briefly talk about some policy recommendations, both at the federal and state levels, and then Corey will go through a framework for advocacy. And just to be clear, these recommendations are meant to combat the negative impacts of private equity and other kinds of extractive ownership models on youth systems. It's not meant to be a panacea for all of the problems that affect these systems. But we can start on the federal level. So the first thing I want to flag is the Stop Wall Street Looting Act, which is legislation that was introduced in the Senate in 2019 and then again in 2021, and would basically overhaul how private equity is regulated across all industries. So it goes beyond youth systems or behavioral health. And the key for us here is increased transparency in what firms have to disclose about their investments, limits on extractive policies like the ones we talked about earlier, including dividend recapitalizations and the use of debt, and creating joint liability. And so that essentially makes private equity firms liable for any debt or litigation that involves the companies they own, which would be an incredibly useful tool for holding them accountable. And then a federal database of facility owners would also be an incredibly useful tool for oversight and for consumer advocacy. And this idea has actually already been proposed as a CMS effort for nursing homes. So something similar for all residential psych facilities would be similarly helpful. And that could include listing the firms and their investors, as well as different types of facilities they own and where, which would also provide significant transparency. And then finally, there's a need for greater enforcement and monitoring of private equity firms' role in Medicare and Medicaid fraud under the False Claims Act. So without getting too wonky, state AG's offices and the Department of Justice can basically bring claims against companies for defrauding government programs through things like overcharging for services, billing for services that they don't actually provide, providing services by unqualified or underqualified staff, something Corey mentioned earlier, having billing for service provided by a tech that should be provided by a nurse, for example. But the private equity firms that are incentivizing or even driving the fraudulent activity almost always escape liability for it. And even if they own multiple companies that have defrauded the government programs. And so regulators basically should more closely scrutinize the private equity owners for their role in the fraud and hold them accountable. And this is something we've seen a little bit over the past few years, even in mental health. But I think that there is a growing interest by the DOJ and by state AG's office is in various places to do more of this. So on the state level, states should, first of all, try to streamline regulatory authority so that there's just one oversight hub with all of the information collected on a provider. And this would help combat the data silos that are created when you get numerous different regulatory bodies involved in evaluating providers. And so that an oversight hub like that should be clearly communicated and accessible to the public, so that there's an interface for stakeholders to ask questions, issue complaints, access information. And that it should also increase scrutiny on facility finances, which is less maybe a sort of public-facing disclosure, but doing things like reviewing transfers in ownership or requiring budgets to be submitted for examining patient loss ratios, just making all ownership data public. And then states should consider barring contracts with for-profit providers and out-of-state placement agencies. And as Corey mentioned, there's been a ton of great work on this in the last couple of years, partially as a result or almost entirely as a result of the amazing investigation and advocacy done around SQL, I think by a number of people on this call. And then finally, I think probably most obviously, there should be greater investment in home and community-based services. And that can happen both at the state and the federal level.
So as Eileen mentioned, the start, the policies that suggested would be really, really helpful and improve conditions, but they're not silver bullet policies and may not address all the structural underpinnings that allow private equity into the youth system. And the silver bullet type policies that can, things like single payer healthcare and abolishing the Senate, adding justices to the Supreme Court, we should absolutely be advocating for these things, but I don't think they're a bit too large for us to seriously recommend as actionable today. So we do want to offer something, and instead it's a framework that call a culture of resistance to channel our advocacy through that embraces and continues the collective energy that permeated from the 2020 uprisings into our work on SQL and advocacy in general. And for us, a culture of resistance places behavioral health, youth justice, for today's purposes, private equity's involvement in these areas at the forefront. Other organizations may have different centers and use different tactics, but we're united under a larger shared culture. And we recognize that this is all part of a larger challenge to our healthcare and social welfare systems, racial capitalism, and the neoliberal governance that insulates financial markets from social justice. And we can start beginning how these political and social forces can cause and exacerbate behavioral health conditions themselves. So I want to elaborate a little further on what we think this culture of resistance means, how we use it, and some examples of how it could lead to collaboration against private equity with some creative other organizations. And so first, quickly, I want to detail some core principles for this culture of resistance that guide what we're going to do. First, healthcare is a human right, not an avenue for speculation or profit. Next, we view health as a collective effort rooted in individual experiences that requires mass action. And finally, abolition means abolishing all systems of prejudice. And with these core principles in mind, any cost-based justification for private equity in healthcare is moot. This is a right and must be offered with equitable outcomes and access for everyone. And we work backwards from there. Embracing our presence in a larger collective, we should candidly assess our organization's strengths and tactics with the goal of maximizing them horizontally as they complement others in the culture. So for example, working at a protection and advocacy agency, we have records and facility access authority grounded in federal law. This gives us the ability to enter places and see information that other can't, and some bureaucratic legitimacy rooted in the federal P&A laws. But these connections with the state may limit our ability to do something like protest outside of a judge or politician's home the way grassroots activists could. But recognizing these differences, we can engage with these grassroots activists about the issues they've seen, use our access and facilities authority to share stories with these activists, either directly or through public dissemination. And then those can be used as a basis or support for that demonstration led by the grassroots activists. There's a rich history of this with disability rights advocates working horizontally and recognizing their role as part of a larger struggle. I'm going to play some audio from Elaine Brown, the former Black Panther Party chairwoman, discusses the Black Panthers' participation in the 1977 504 sit-ins, where they joined with disability rights advocates through the Center for Independent Living and student activists from Berkeley to occupy a federal building for more than 3 weeks, successfully demanding that federal regulations for Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act get enacted.
We had free clinics. We had free food programs in general. We did all of these things because we saw these as building and organizing people around their basic needs and their right to have them, right to have food, right to have, freedom of movement and so forth. All of these rights were connected to us. And we recognized that when we joined with others and joined others with us, that our freedom was tied to the freedom of everyone else. And that is a very important thing. So we were not speaking just of rights under the law, civil rights, that is. We talked about the freedom of everyone. And eventually we met with and learned about the Center for Independent Living and met with Ed Roberts. But I think probably our...
And I just want to also, I just have this picture of a newspaper clipping following the victory of the 504 sit-ins. And I just really love that sign. You don't have to see it to know. I think that really embodies a lot of what we're talking about today. And additionally, we should focus on individual relationships and the experiences of other stakeholders, assessing the reciprocal value of them. What are we getting from them? And are we providing others information that they can use to advance our shared interests? We should observe the challenges we see in others' experiences, be they youth, their parents or guardians, a state official, employees at a facility or service provider. And we shouldn't be afraid to lean on people, third parties who are particularly helpful, an awesome social worker at a troubling facility. But the flip side of that is if there's truly an unproductive relationship, State Department of Health that just does not want to hear it, another organization who we are just opposed with should not feel guilty about walking away and practicing some engaged withdrawal. Our support for the policy reforms like Eileen discussed earlier can also draw from this analysis. Policy that theoretically has benefits, but requires rigorous reporting by underpaid facility staff or places a massive burden on state regulators might not be worth pursuing if it's unlikely to be enforced and takes significant time that already stretched-thin stakeholders may not have. And this ease of experience analysis should also extend to youth and their parents or guardians. We all know from personal and professional experience how stressful and frustrating it can be to engage with healthcare bureaucracy and form filling out. Reforms that are smaller reforms, just things like simplifying forms without negatively impacting treatment quality, are worth pursuing because they improve individual experiences. They're practical improvements, and they might not alter the structure of private equity, but they build trust, knowledge, and ultimately time for larger systemic efforts. And I want to look now at how we can collaborate with other groups within a culture of resistance to challenge private equity. And I want to begin with labor unions. Corollary to the study that Eileen explained from 2021 on private equity owned nursing homes is a study from last month on COVID-19 safety at nursing homes that found nursing facilities with unionized staff have 6.8% less COVID deaths than those that don't. And this may seem small, but for the facilities that were examined for this study, that amounted to 8,000 lives. There are similar results for COVID safety and unionized labor forces in schools and grocery stores. Unfortunately, there's nothing specific on youth system or juvenile justice facilities or behavioral health facilities. But this is still an avenue for collaboration. And to be clear, we have a different perspective than labor unions. And in some areas, especially in incidents between a resident and staff, we might be opposed. But here we're united. Care worker unions have a long history opposing private equity. SEIU 1199 Vice President Millie Silva testified at a 2021 congressional hearing on private equity in healthcare. The lack of financial transparency and oversight in the nursing home sector has meant that some operators attempt to provide the least amount of care at the highest possible price rather than the highest quality of care in the most efficient way. Millie's talking about this centered on staff and consequently how it impacts residents. Our analysis is centered on the residents and consequently how that impacts staff. But our analysis is the same. On this issue, we're not opposed. We both want care that is safe, supportive, and nurturing, and where hardworking staff members are fairly compensated for what they do, rather than health benefits and dollars being siphoned away by a private equity firm. And second, coalition, I call it anti-carceral public safety or decarceration. As with the youth system, private equity has infected the adult carceral state, and not just in for-profit prisons, but services within them, phone companies, behavioral health service providers. Youth residential facilities and the juvenile justice system are as part of the school to prison pipeline can keep children in private equity's grasp as they become adults. As Eileen discussed earlier, we can organize around this connection and use federal regulations and state regulations, in California and Nevada, as well as federal executive orders that bar for-profit prison contracts as a model for doing so with similar actors in the youth system and the youth behavioral health system. Additionally, when we hear defund the police, we can work with anti-carceral advocates on what a positive vision of this looks like with youth and disability justice at the center. Reallocating funds from law enforcement and for-profit facilities into affirmative community-based services with checks that ensure their service quality and equitable outcomes, not just equitable access. And ultimately, the goal is to build a system where every child's first contact with behavioral health services occurs before their interactions with the carceral state. So I hope that we've shown through this workshop that despite our challenges, the current system permitting private equity to exist and invest in the youth system and behavioral health services is not inevitable. It's not a rational, detached investment by suits in a Wall Street or Silicon Valley boardroom. It's a choice to create an economy that permits these firms to exploit vulnerable, overwhelmingly non-white children reliant on a broken social welfare system.
Corey, you're freezing. I don't know if it's helpful to turn off your camera and maybe we can hear you. We might have lost him for a second.
maybe we can give it a minute and I can try to wrap up. Oh,
Yeah, we can see if he, oh, there we are. Go ahead, sorry.
It was, yes, sorry, I've had a double PowerPoint internet faux pas. But just to conclude, I'll just go back from the start of that slide that I hope we showed through this presentation and the tech errors that have come with it. The current system that permits private equity to exist and invest in the youth systems is not inevitable, nor is it a rational detached investment by suits in a Wall Street or Silicon Valley boardroom. It's a choice to create an economy that permits these private equity firms to exploit for profit vulnerable, overwhelmingly non-white children, relying on a broken social welfare system that leaves them no other options. And this is happening in our towns, cities, and communities. And putting this all together, I'd like to end going back to Lakeside Academy, the sequel facility in Michigan where Cornelius Frederick died, and what happened after the incredible advocacy efforts that led to Michigan revoking Lakeside's license. Kalamazoo County Board of Commissioners, where Lakeside's located, offered to buy the Lakeside property, about 50 acres, for $6 million that they collected through an innovative county tax program addressing housing instability that passed twice by referendum. The program previously provided housing vouchers, but they now sought to repurpose Lakeside and build high quality, affordable housing on its premises. Lakeside accepted a bid for $6 million, but to the surprise of advocates and community groups supporting the county's plan, it was from Oakland Finance LLC, a mysterious entity with an unclear purpose, and up until a few weeks ago when construction began on the old Lakeside campus. It's an expansion of the Kalamazoo Country Club with a new clubhouse and golf performance center. Although our advocacy successfully closed Lakeside, right away it became another battle between luxury umbrage and democratic demands for social welfare. Under a culture of resistance, we pushed for Lakeside's closure and repurposement as one demand, with housing-centered advocates and other allies joining us as we shut Lakeside down, and us with them as we build something better. And that is all we have. Thank you so much for everyone, listening through that. That was really appreciate that.
Yeah, no, thank you guys so much. I know I learned a ton and was taking a bunch of notes in terms of ways we can work together moving forward. I know that there were 2 questions that have already come in, but if other folks have questions, if you want to drop it in the chat or raise your hand, we can do that. So the first question that came in was from Diane Howard. So, you know, we've heard Sequel is renaming some of its facilities as Vivant. I think that their master company has rebranded. And so she just wanted to know what we should be looking out for and if you could provide more details on that.
I think Corey and I both have a similar level of understanding of this, which is limited, and I think very representative of one of the top problems with this kind of ownership model. My understanding is that it's not only a rebrand, that it was a sale, that the Altamont Capital and potentially Jay Ripley sold their ownership stake to a new company. I still think that Jay Ripley, the CEO and founder of Sequel, has some degree of control over the new company based on financial filings that it's filed with different states it's operating in. But beyond that, I think that we know very little. I think in terms of finding out more information, I think we might need to rely on disclosures made to different states where that company operates, whether it's through filing FOIAs with the different regulatory agencies in those states, keeping an eye on other kind of more wonky financial indicators, like whether they take on debt, whether that debt gets rated by credit rating agencies, which I know sort of gets into confusing territory. But all of this is to say, we have very little information on it. We will certainly keep monitoring, and if anyone else has any more info than that, I think we should be sharing as much as we can. Corey, do you have anything to add?
No, I think that sums it. I think there are, I don't know the exact number of the Sequel or formerly Sequel facilities still open. If they're in your state or jurisdiction, to still be keeping tabs on them because they may have switched over. Yeah, that's really all I found. It seems like they're trying to make this a little bit more discreet. We were joking, not really funny, about this yesterday, that Jay Ripley, like, he's so bad at this that it makes, like, it creates a lot of information for us as like presenters. And it really, so we'll see if that trend is followed if he's involved. But there's not much, I think, at this moment.
And I know Larry Canada, who's on, had also mentioned a personal injury lawsuit in Alabama. Do you want to hop in, Larry, and just provide that background on people's restructure?
Yeah, I'll try. I don't want to go through the whole thing right now, but you're correct in that it was a buyout of the Altamont interests. There was a number of personal injury lawsuits because of Sequel's fine care of our kids here in Alabama, slamming them on the ground and breaking jaws and things like that. And it was filed in the state court, and the removal had the new structure, which is the Vivant Behavioral Services or health services. It also listed all the owners because it is an LLC. In order to determine diversity, you have to list every partner, every individual who has a financial interest in it, so that you can determine diversity. So the Alabama entity, Sequel TSI of Alabama, was rebranded. It's the same company, but the ownership above that has changed, so that Vivant and the owners, like Ripley, all the partners are different. Basically, it's some of the same original partners that have come back in to buy Altamont out. Send me an email. I'll send you what I know.
Will do.
Thank you, Larry. Always helpful and grateful to have you on the call. So the next question was from Madeline Martinez, and it was, has the Biden administration telegraphed in any way whether they're in support or opposition of legislation to oppose more robust federal oversight over private equity investments in behavioral health services?
Yes, I think they have telegraphed it. I think a lot of it is related to the administration's interest in more oversight of private equity ownership of nursing homes. And I think they see that as the first step. So like I mentioned before, they are interested in creating a federal database of providers, and that includes ownership data. I think like that, and like the other reforms that the administration is proposing, they're mainly focused on transparency and reporting as a first step. And I think they're also interested in creating a kind of committee in collaboration with HHS and CMS to monitor sort of the impacts, using something like an ownership database as a jumping off point. So all of that, again, is in the nursing home space, but I have definitely been telegraphed by the administration that there is a strong interest in doing something like this in behavioral health, and in particular the troubled teen industry, as it's called. Would you add anything, Corey?
No, I think that's about it. And Eileen definitely has more, does more work and experience in that space. But I mean, the words are there like that from where I've seen it. I think Biden even mentioned it in the State of the Union, the nursing home study, which was pretty like remarkable that it's gotten up to that point. I think on this point that there's clearly interest within the administration, but whether it happens or not, we need 50 votes. So.
And then the other question, and this is a stat that you mentioned, Corey, and I just was hoping to get more details. You had mentioned that there was a study about community-based care versus the PRTF care, and that kids with high needs and who had had contact with the legal system had better outcomes in community-based care. Do you mind either restating that stat or providing some detail on where that came from? I know that they've seen similar results in California as when they've brought kids back due to sequel, but I wasn't sure if it was a different study you were referencing.
So this was, I'm getting it up just so I say everything correct here. This was a report to the President and Congress by the Secretary of Health and Human Services, which was Sebelius in 2013. Sebelius, yeah, I should know that. But it was a 4-year demonstration. So it was a federal demonstration that for 4 years, I think from 2006 to 2010, did this through, it was people who would have been eligible for PRTF admission based on the clinical needs, instead receiving services through system of care, a systems of care approach. I'm happy to provide a link. It's a pretty short results report on what happened. I'm looking if there is a, the 32% quote, I'm looking, can look and see if there's like a specific, for the specific language they use. But yeah, these participants showed the most improvement in the following areas. Decreased juvenile justice is what's listed first. The common theme across all states is that children and youth with the highest level of need at baseline benefited most from participating in the demonstration. These participants showed the most improvement in, and they list a few things, including juvenile justice involvement. So yeah, I'm happy to send that, Allison, to disseminate out. It's a very interesting report.
That'd be fantastic. I know, like I mentioned, we've heard preliminary reports out of California when they brought kids back from sequel, that the majority, I think it was like 70% of the kids went to community-based programming or like just general housing services for young people, and had no were successfully completing school and had no interaction with law enforcement. And so I think the more we can raise up that, you know, these facilities aren't needed, that they're not serving a purpose, and that community-based alternatives can meet kids' needs, I think that that's really promising. So yeah, I'd love to see that. Thank you. And I know that there are a bunch of questions in terms of posting the recording and making sure we stay in touch. So we will share this recording with all the registrants. We'll post it online, and we'll be sure to share it with the folks at NJJN, and with you, Eileen, in case there's others in your network that you would want to make sure it goes out to. And we'll make sure to also share the reports that have been put out by the private, by Eileen's group and by NJJN with the recommendations, so that folks have those on hand as well. And then in terms of, it's a great question in terms of how we can stay in touch moving forward around a listserv or other things. I know that a number of folks on this call and NJJN members have partnered with NDRN in terms of a working group around the Stop Sequel work. And so it's possible that we can continue to host that working group, but just sort of focus more broadly on private equity and some of these reforms that have been outlined here as solutions. So we'll circle back when we send out the recording with some next steps and ways that we can continue to work together. I wasn't sure if there's any other
Allison?
questions that I missed. Yes, please.
All right. Yeah, why don't you and I talk, because there have been some other things sort of formulating on this end, so maybe we can connect up.
Yeah, that'd be great. You are going to be my first call. So that's perfect. I guess I had one final question, and please, if others have questions, jump in or drop them in the chat if I miss them. But that was in terms of the Wall Street Looting Act, because I know that's not something that NJJN's network has advocated on previously. Do you guys have a better sense of who's leading that effort and ways that our members could get involved?
That was introduced by Senator Elizabeth Warren's office. So those would be the folks to talk to first.
And are there like particular community advocates that you know that are leading like a public education effort?
There is a group called Americans for Financial Reform. And I can include contact info for them when we're rounding up all the other stuff we want to send out to folks. And then I mean, I've been in close touch with their office about that legislation as well. So folks can just contact me and I can try to put them in touch.
Wonderful. Thank you, guys. Well, it looks like those are all the questions. If anyone has one and wants to unmute, see now. And then I didn't know, Eileen or Corey, if there was anything sort of closing you wanted to share with folks.
No, yeah, thank you for having us do this. And I think what we can do is just continue doing these sorts of things and staying in touch and widening widening what we're able to do. I'm really happy that Eileen's here, and like part of this, with making those connections between, researchers and the on the ground advocates, that's their worst nightmare. It's that they don't have a tool to stop that. So I'm just really glad that we had the opportunity to do this, and yeah, we will all remain engaged with one another.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all for joining. Thank you, Corey and Eileen, for sharing your expertise, and we'll follow up with the recording and different materials as well. So thank you, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.